since the very beginning. Aviation was invented here in the U.S. It's grown into a global industry, but the U.S. continues to play the most significant role in defining what those standards need to be, what the technologies are that characterize that industry, and how those get deployed in a common system throughout the world.
Today's guest is Michael Huerta, former FAA Administrator and recipient of ATCA's highest honor, the Glen A. Gilbert Memorial Award. Michael is known for his steady, principled, and servant-hearted leadership. In this episode, we talk about what leadership looks like in a large government organization, bringing people together, and how service evolves when the title goes away. Let's get into it.
This is Quebec on Air. CEO and co-founder Hisham Jalil built a workplace that people trust. Now he's interviewing other people-first leaders to explore what shapes them. Today's episode of Quebec on Air is brought to you by Quebec. We help organizations improve processes, decision-making, and performance. Stay tuned for more.
So today I'm joined by Mr. Michael Huerta. Thank you for coming in.
It's great to be here.
Former FAA Administrator for 6 years? 5 years?
5-year term and a little over a year as acting.
Wow. So it's an honor to have you here. And tomorrow night, you're receiving ATCA's highest honor, the Glen A. Gilbert Memorial Award. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
I'll be at that soiree. So I'm excited to experience that with you and see you up there. So that's pretty cool. So Mr. Jeff Planty, a common friend, old colleague from yours, a colleague of mine, a mentor, and an excellent human. I asked him, give me 3 words about Michael Huerta. These are the 3 words: steady, principled, and servant-hearted. Does that ring a bell with you? Does that resonate?
Well, that's incredibly nice of him to say that. I mean, steady, if you're in an organization like the FAA, it's a fascinating organization because it's one of those rare industries, one of those rare organizations where you have a very simple performance measure. One of our leaders, Peggy Gilligan, put it this way once, and I thought it was just perfect. She said, at the end of the day, you want the same number of landings as takeoffs. And then every day, it starts all over again. And so you are constantly needing to take account of everything that is going on in the world, anything that is going on that day, and perform to the very best of your ability. There has to be a level of consistency across that. You have to learn to expect the unexpected. Something's going to get thrown at you, and it's really a question of how you respond to it. So I guess that's what Jeff is talking about when he says steady. That's what we're all about, trying to maintain a level of steadiness. It's not just me. It's the whole team at the FAA. When I first came to the agency, what I was struck by is what a different agency it is from the entire federal government. If you walk around Washington, D.C., or you go to any federal organization, just randomly ask the people, where do they work? I would bet you that more than half of them will say, I work for the government. If you talk to anyone who works at the FAA and you ask them that same question, they will say, I work for the FAA. There is a clarity of mission there and a sense of purpose that is really unique among government agencies. And so I had the privilege of leading an incredible team of people when I was there. And it's really one of the finest places to work and one of the best organizations to lead.
That's awesome. I actually was thinking about it. We're Quebec, we support the FAA. And when people ask me, I say that. I don't say we're a government contractor. First of all, it sounds kind of like bland and like, what does that mean, right? Because there's thousands and thousands, maybe tens of thousands. And I'd rather say like what we're specifically doing, who we're specifically helping, because it is a sort of a unique mission. It's very important, obviously, from a safety perspective. It's important for the GDP, for the economy, and just for everybody in general. So I see that, and that makes sense. That's interesting to me. So let's talk about this. Where are you from?
Well, I grew up in Southern California, in a part of Southern California, not LA, not San Francisco. I grew up in an area that's known as the Inland Empire. It's about 60 miles east of Los Angeles. And when I grew up, it was largely agricultural. My dad and his brothers all worked in California's orange industry. And
Wow.
what they did was pick oranges. That's what immigrant laborers did when they first came to the United States from Mexico. So that part of California is now booming. It started out more as a bedroom community of Los Angeles and Orange County. It's now, a major research university where I had the privilege of going to school at the University of California at Riverside, and a big, rapidly growing area. It was a great place to grow up. We used to say, the Chamber of Commerce in Riverside used to brag that it was an hour away from the beach, an hour away from the mountains, and an hour away from the desert, which to those of us who lived there that means we're in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, that's true.
It was a great place to grow up. I still have a lot of friends and family there.
Brothers, sisters?
3 sisters.
3 sisters, okay. Are you the oldest?
No, I'm the second oldest. And my 3 sisters would probably all tell you that I was always the privileged one that got away with stuff that they would never get away with. But,
my sister says the same thing about me. Yeah, it's a sister thing, I think. But
yep.
That's interesting. Okay. And so up until what age did you live there? And
well, I went to college, as I mentioned, at UC Riverside. And then when it came time to go to graduate school, I had the thought that I wanted to be a diplomat. And so I applied to a lot of schools of international affairs to get a master's program and was accepted at Princeton. And that was my first time actually moving away from California. I went out to New Jersey on an airplane by myself. My parents didn't come out with me to get me settled there, and enrolled in the master's program at Princeton in public policy and international relations. And I was really thinking that what I wanted to do was study for the Foreign Service exam and eventually wind up in an embassy. Part of the program at Princeton is you spend the summer in between the 2 years of the program in an internship in your chosen profession. So I had the privilege and the opportunity to spend that summer in an embassy. It was actually, our mission to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. It was really eye-opening for me, but one of the things that it caused me to question is, do I really want to be a diplomat? And that's not a knock on the important work that diplomats do. They do an incredible job representing our interests all around the world and with important international organizations like NATO. But it's a very different model than actually being heavily involved in an operating system that affects people's lives. And I found that that's really where my passion was, where I can be involved in the operations of, something that's incredibly important to our economy, something that's incredibly important to people generally. And so you see that thread in my career, as I have taken on positions in city government where you're very close to the citizens and what their needs and wants are, and the FAA, which is an incredibly important operational part of our entire economy. It's not just a government agency. You think about, the thousands of people that get on flights every day. They're probably thinking about a lot of things. They're thinking about where they're going to be crowds at the airport, whether they're going to encounter weather, whether everything's going to be on time. But what they're not thinking about is it safe?
That's true.
And that's really a credit to the men and women in the FAA and across the industry that have worked for decades to make it safe. And so being a part of that, and in that important mission is something that I'm just incredibly passionate about.
That's awesome. Yeah, I sometimes I think about, I just flew back. I was in Mexico. I was sitting there and just, everyone's on their phone, eating, watching something. It's just interesting, you're 500-600 miles an hour sitting in a chair, 30,000 feet, and you're not even thinking about it, right? But if you were to think about it, you're like, that's kind of wild, right? That we get to do that, and the plane turns around in 10 minutes, and the next one goes, and it is a marvel, and it's obviously very important that there's no shadow of a doubt of safety. Otherwise, I think the whole thing kind of could potentially start to fall apart, right? Like, because it's really based on that feeling of safety. So why did you want to first be a diplomat? And then was there a moment that something specific happened that made you kind of change?
I wanted to be a diplomat because I've always been interested in the larger world. Maybe it's growing up in a small town. Maybe it's growing up in a part of the country, where Everything's very comfortable, but I've always just had an interest in other countries, other cultures, other, ways of doing business and just kind of getting out and seeing things. I think some in my family would say it was grounded in a belief I need to get out of here. but, and I think maybe that was a part of it. I was in second grade when President Kennedy was assassinated. But, we were in a period of time where U.S. influence was really growing rapidly all around the world. And being part of that was incredibly exciting. And where the U.S. was stepping into and continues to step into incredibly important roles, whether it's, trying to ensure peace and stability, whether it's trying to champion individual rights and liberties, things like freedom of expression and so forth. It was also a time where, as our economies were evolving and developing, where doing things like establishing standards around the world that everyone can emulate and subscribe to. And so that was sort of what was behind it. I wouldn't say that there was a moment where I said, I don't want to be a diplomat, more a moment when it became apparent that that interest in the larger world was not going away. It was just, how could I be part of it in a different way?
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than the diplomatic route, when I finished my graduate program and started my career, I was really focused on international trade, more the business aspect of it. And how do we develop new markets for our producers? How do we create opportunities for U.S. companies? How do we bring the world together through trade? And I'm a big believer that the more you bring the world together in shared economic, cultural, and other interests, it's just good for the global community generally. And so it's not like my international ambitions went away. It's just that they evolved into a different form. And, you think about it, let's take aviation, where we really, have since the very beginning, aviation was invented here in the U.S. It's grown into a global industry, but the U.S. continues to play the most significant role in defining what those standards need to be, what the technologies are that characterize that industry, and how those get deployed in a common system throughout the world. So it's been an evolution.
Yeah, I think we control 70% of the oceanic
well, think about it as the northern half of the oceans on both sides of the U.S.
Yeah, that's a lot.
That are U.S. control. Yeah,
responsible for a lot. Okay, so yeah, it sounds like your international flavor for things was about sort of diversity and different aspects and bringing people together, and you wanted to see maybe some of your change was related to affecting change in a different way or affecting things in a different way. At what point did you accidentally stumble into leadership? Sometimes people do, right? Sometimes you're like, oh, I just got a promotion. Now I'm somebody's leader, or I'm leading this group. Or is that something you've always wanted to do and realized, I want to pursue this?
I never really thought of it as I want to be the head of a large organization or I want to be a CEO. And my first foray into a significant leadership position was when I was 29 years old. I had been doing consulting work. I was on a USAID project in the Eastern Caribbean when I got a call from the office of then New York City Mayor Ed Koch, asking about my interest in potentially leading an agency that they were reshaping really to focus much more on international business development for New York City. And I was kind of clueless when I got the call. I suggested that the guy who called me call my boss, who would be really good at that. So he did. He called my boss, and my boss pointed him right back to me. And that was the beginning of that conversation. It was an agency that was known at that time as the Department of Ports and Terminals. It was renamed and reshaped as Department of Ports and Trade. And it had, a couple of important functions, but, one was that it serves as the underlying landowner and partner of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey for facilities that are operated in the city of New York. And there's a technical reason for that, and that is that most of these are on the waterfront in New York City. And in New York City, waterfront property needs to be held in trust for all the people, meaning that you can't have an entity that is not a New York City entity, owning those facilities. And so we served as landlord to the Port Authority. We were also responsible for leading the city's efforts to try to bring more and different types of international business operations to the city of New York. New York has always been a financial center. It's not like New York has ever had a difficult time attracting banks or, financial services companies to the city. But what the city really wanted to focus on was to really tell a story about how it's a great place for manufacturing and for certain types of assembly operations to serve the U.S. market. And so it was to tell that larger story of New York and to work with companies about setting up operations. And the other thing was to also change or enhance some international perceptions of New York City, that it's not just Manhattan, that there are the other four boroughs. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of opportunities there for doing things like manufacturing operations, like customer care operations and so forth. And so it was a great opportunity. But that was my first time leading a large group of people. I went from there to a similar job in the Port of San Francisco, and then ultimately, came into the federal fold.
Okay. And I see you ended up being a U.S. DOT Chief of Staff? Yeah. And Associate Deputy Secretary. So that's what you're talking about when you got into the federal government?
Well, when President Clinton was elected in 1992, I was at that point leading the Port of San Francisco and received a call about my interest in throwing my hat into the ring for a position at US DOT. I came out and had an interview with the new incoming secretary, Federico Pena, and he brought me in to lead what was a relatively new office in DOT at that time. And it was really to encourage the different modal agencies across DOT, highways, transit, and what have you, to think and to work in a more integrated fashion around how do you improve mobility. And it was primarily focused around surface transportation, but it was dealing with a lot of challenges associated with how do you provide connections. A good example of what we focused on was there was a major project at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach in California where we're looking for better connections to the rail infrastructure as our largest import port complex in the U.S. for distributing their product throughout the country. And rather than dealing with, miles of truck connections from the harbor to the rail yards, how do you provide direct rail access? And so one of the projects that we spent a lot of time and focus on was a project that became known as the Alameda Corridor, which connected that port complex to the rail network and actually took thousands and thousands of trucks off Los Angeles highways, to provide better connections. It was those kinds of, how do you ensure that the connections work, not just, the base infrastructure.
Sure.
After President Clinton's first term, Secretary Pena went on to become Secretary of Energy, and Rodney Slater, who had been the Federal Highway Administrator, became our secretary, and he asked me to join him in the front office as his Chief of Staff. And that was a wonderful opportunity. I learned an awful lot from Secretary Slater. He is one of those rare people that has this ability to motivate people, really to be their best. And by focusing on how do you bring people together, to share perspectives. And Secretary Pena had a lot of that as well. But of course, when you're the chief of staff, you are with the secretary all the time. Mm-hmm. I got to see Rodney Slater in so many different settings where you would see people come into a room feeling incredibly frustrated, sometimes angry, maybe feeling like their needs aren't being met by DOT. And he had this amazing ability to hear people out, and to bring people together, but also to sometimes bring them along in understanding that they need to change their perspective as well. Really remarkable individual.
Did you take some lessons there that
I
you
did.
used later?
I did. One of the things that I learned from Secretary Slater was the importance of bringing people together and recognizing that everyone has a contribution to make. And there are a lot of dimensions to that. One is you have to recognize that people will have perspectives, and often I might feel that they're wrong. We can have the argument about why they're wrong, or you can approach it in a different way, which is to look at it in the context of, okay, they have this perspective. Mm-hmm. So I have to deal with them on that level. And you're doing a couple of things if you approach someone in that way. You're not hitting them right off with, here is why you're wrong, which everyone will get defensive about. And instead, you're respecting, okay, you have a point of view. Let me share an alternative. And that gets you into a much more productive conversation because you're meeting people where they are. Mm-hmm. And that's so important, I think, for any leader, that you have to recognize that you can't assume that everyone is going to follow you, even though you might have the title of leader. There is a certain amount of proving that you have what it takes to be a good leader that makes you a much more effective leader. And that means that you have to earn the trust and the support of those that you're leading.
So is that accountability over authority, essentially? So in other words, like, I guess you can gain people's respect, or maybe the respect's not the right term, but the ability for them to follow you and if you want them to do something based on your authority, but that only lasts so long, right? You get like a little bit of, you can use that a little bit, but to really have them follow you long term or be a part of the group long term is probably more accountability, you being accountable to them.
Yeah, I think about it that there are kind of two types of leaders. The first I'll call positional leaders, and they lead basically through an organization chart. They're up at the top and everyone reports to them. And so therefore they're the leader. And some people make entire careers, and do that very effectively. But it's a style which is, I am the boss, you work for me, here's what I need you to do. The second type of leader are those that I would say are leaders through influence. And those people can be anywhere in an organization chart. Mm-hmm. You think about that in organizations, there are people that other employees gravitate to. And sometimes they're not in a leadership position, but you recognize that they have a great deal of influence over, many of their peers and many of sometimes people that are even superior to them. And it's superior in an organizational sense to them. Mm-hmm. It's this second category that I think makes much more effective leaders, because they're not relying on where they sit in an organization chart. What they're relying on are the strength of their ideas, the persuasiveness of their arguments. But I think a big part of their ability to do that is that they're demonstrating an openness, an ability to listen where people are feeling heard. And oftentimes when there are disagreements, it's not that the objective is to try to convince someone to change their view, but the most important thing you can do is that they feel heard, mm-hmm. that they feel they had the opportunity to express what might be bothering them or what might be concerning them. But there is also a recognition that people, organizations, they may go a different way, and that's okay. It's all a question of, did I have the opportunity, to express my view and to express my concerns, and were they considered?
Yeah, so it's about influence and not necessarily being in charge. And by the way, in a small business like ours, sometimes I'll get people come up to me and say, I want to be a leader. Mm-hmm. They typically mean a job position, a management type of position. Yeah. Again, in my opinion, I said in a different podcast, but I think you manage processes, you manage things, you lead people. They're two different things.
It's a good way to put it.
And I think what I tell sometimes, if they truly are, showing leadership without certain titles, they may already be being a leader, right? And the problem is we just don't have unlimited titles to give people, right? It's like a bank where everybody's a vice president. Like you can get everybody that title, but that's not really what I think they're deep down looking for, right? They probably want a formalization of their ability to influence and help people. But the bottom line is, there's leaders in every organization that don't have the title, and they could be the janitor. I mean, it could be anybody, right? Any position. And I think if those people start to see that, and that's just like leadership's job, upper leadership, if you will, to let them know that they are actually leading people by leading by example, by how they treat others, how they treat those people. It's interesting because many years back, I won't use names, but there was a person who was really good at getting people together to have fun. And it wasn't just about the fun. It was like they rally people around them, right? And they create that vibe and the energy. And so if that person was to do something that wasn't a good example, I would tell them, like, you're a leader. Like, yes, you're not a manager, but you're a leader. So if you're doing this, you're setting a bad example for everybody. And I hope they understood that at the time and carried that forward. But yeah, I completely agree with that. How does that work in the government structure, though? Because, it's not quite the military side of the government, but there's still, there are positions and hierarchies, and there's still people who, hey, I'm this title, I'll tell you what to do. How do you work around that as you climbed up to some of the higher ranks in government?
When I first joined the government, and I mentioned I was in this position for Secretary Pena, it was not necessarily a position where I was leading in the context of the org chart that all the different parts, component agencies of DOT reported to me. It was more where, encouraging, greater intermodal cooperation and coordination across them. And so that was a pretty important part of it. The ability to demonstrate to them, this is why it's in your interest to actually be part of these more cooperative efforts, because it's actually good for the American people, and that's who we're all here to support. The FAA, when I first joined it, somebody made the joke that it's actually as hierarchical, it's just another branch of the military. And they meant it kind of tongue in cheek, because we do have a lot of people that move from our services into the FAA. Would, for example, many former military controllers become air traffic controllers. Likewise, aviation safety inspectors. We had a large complement that came over from the military, and it's not uncommon. And people characterize it as an incredibly hierarchical organization, which it is. There's no question about that. I think that navigating that for me became, how do we open up a level of communication, and so that everything is not always filtered through, a dozen different layers before it gets to the front line. And the way I navigated that was by opening up lines of communication with the front line. One of the things that I did was I started a regular process of town hall meetings. And this would be with the entire agency, 50,000 employees, and we'd do it, I think, once a quarter. The format was pretty straightforward, that I would spend less than half of it talking about, here's what's going on, here's what you've been reading about in perhaps the broader news media or, what you've been chatting about. I want you to hear directly from me what's going on. And oftentimes that would relate to, we dealt with challenges like the sequester. We dealt with our annual budget process. We dealt with, different activities around our hiring process. We also had a major fire at Chicago Center, and we had to talk about what we were doing about that. So there was always, some topic. But then, the majority of the discussion was an opportunity for them to ask questions. What I always found was the questions are very good. They were very thoughtful questions about what's happening not only in the agency, but the broader government. How is it affecting them? What's happening across the industry? Or what's happening in terms of new technologies? Like when I was at the agency, it was when drones were first, becoming much more prevalent out there. And how are we going to regulate this? Or what is the appropriate way to do that? This is a whole new and nascent industry. And they don't come out of the traditional aviation sector. So how do we How do we get our hands around that? And so really, really good questions. And so the town halls, I think, were really important in terms of just sharing information. The other thing that I did was, as administrator, I traveled a lot, and every place I went, I would ask our team to arrange for me to visit whatever FAA facility might be in the neighborhood. And there are a lot of them. Now, it's relatively easy to visit air traffic control towers. They're right there at the airport when you're coming and going. But I visited our flight standards district offices. I visited a lot of our certification offices and a lot of our places where a lot of our maintenance technicians might have been based. And it would do the same thing. I would, an hour visit, spends a little bit of time walking around, and then gather the employees together, and the same kind of Q&A format. And those were incredibly valuable for me in terms of sharing with me what people on the front line were thinking. And I would like to think it was valuable for them. And the message that it sent was, yes, we have our organizational chart. Yes, you have to respect that your leadership, perhaps in your facility, is going to be making some important decisions, but it also gave them an opportunity to understand what's going on higher up in the organization. And I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's important to do both. You have to empower your leaders to exercise their leadership and to make the tough decisions, but you have to maintain a level of communication across everyone and a belief on their part that they understand where they are, in the larger organization, the larger ecosystem of the agency. And sometimes there's fear that, oh, well, if you go and talk to the frontline employees, you're undermining your leadership. That's not my experience. My experience is that you can still provide the support and respect to people that are in management and leadership roles, but maintain that level of communication with everyone.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're just there to listen and you're talking about things that are happening at the larger scale. I mean, you're not giving that employee a direct, action to go do something, right? That's when it starts to get probably.
Well, and it was interesting too. It also makes a difference because the message you're sending to people on the front line is what they do is important. One of the most striking visits I made was to a major certification facility. I walked in and there were, we had, a couple of hundred employees in the room. And the facility manager introduced me. And when he introduced me, he made this point. He goes, I just want to note that this is the first time the administrator has walked through the door of this place in 30 years.
Wow.
And I was shocked by that.
Yeah.
As it turned out, I visited that facility, I think, 3 more times during my tenure at the FAA. But I think that it sends an important message that you're not just some cog in a wheel. You're actually doing incredibly important work that's being recognized by the leadership of the organization. And the first thing that they're hearing is, thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah, that's for sure, especially in a really big organization.
Yeah.
It goes back to being, to feeling like you're being heard. You're not just a number. And that you're a normal human as well. I think sometimes, you maybe they only see you on a Zoom or on TV and think you're not a real human. You don't have feelings, or you don't, you have to build trust with people, and it's easiest in person and just talking, right, than anything else. So speaking of the FAA and that very important job of being administrator, how did you get to that point? How do you even get that job?
Well, I had, after working in the Clinton administration, I went off and worked in the technology industry. A company called Affiliated Computer Services, and I was responsible for the Transportation Solutions Group. And the work that we did, nobody's ever heard of Affiliated Computer Services, but you have probably heard of what we were involved in. We were the integrator and operator for a large portion of a program known as EasyPass, the electronic toll collection system here in the Eastern U.S., its West Coast counterpart. We developed a lot of smart card programs for public transit agencies. A lot of ours was Europe-based, but it would, where you can tag your card and use it on trains, you can use it on trams, buses, across the entire transit infrastructure. And then a lot of pretty sophisticated and high security parking management programs that might be deployed, say, at airports or other critical infrastructure, where you not only want to collect revenue from people that are parking there, but you also want to have the right kind of security, given the importance of the infrastructure that's there. So when President Obama was elected, I was asked to join the transition team. And I think basically, I think bluntly speaking, what they did is they went to former DOT officials from the Clinton administration to form the nucleus of the Obama transition team for transportation. And it was in that capacity that I was working on a lot of the issues that the new administration needed to get involved with. And the incoming Secretary Ray LaHood, thought that it would be good for me to come in and get involved in and play a leadership role on what was then the air traffic modernization program known as NextGen. And he made an interesting comment. He said, you've been deploying technology in a government setting, and that's a really important thing, as we think about how this program is going to evolve. And I said, well, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that a mission-critical toll collection system on the New Jersey Turnpike is in the same league as what you're talking about. The secretary said, but it is important that you're working in a government setting and you're having to bring together a lot of different stakeholders in doing that. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, I came in as deputy administrator working under Randy Babbitt, and Randy asked me to play kind of the leadership role as a chief next-gen officer, to work with the team in the air traffic organization. We stood up the NextGen, or the NextGen organization existed. We stood up a program management office to manage, a lot of the programs that were there. And some of the things that we had to focus on were when I first joined the agency, our en route modernization needed to be rebaseline. We took care of that. We also really started to bring stakeholders together through the NextGen Advisory Committee to talk about capabilities that we were looking for. And then how do we prioritize the deployment of those capabilities? It was interesting. I was working on the transition team, and I didn't really expect that I would come back in to government. But as I went through that work, what became apparent to me is I kind of missed the role that you can play in having significant influence that affects a whole lot of people, that goes way beyond what any one company can do. I was very honored when Secretary LaHood asked me to join the FAA and then ultimately to be administrator.
And then I think it's in the ATCA article where there's a picture of you and Obama sitting in the Oval Office, I assume?
Yeah.
Is that when there's a famous thing where you were going through your resume and he stopped you? Is that correct?
That's an interesting story. So when I met with President Obama in the Oval Office, he began our discussion with, well, tell me about yourself. Okay, you're in a job interview, so what we'll do, you're going to talk about your jobs. And I started to talk about some of the jobs that I had had, and he put up his hand and he said, I know all of that. Tell me about where you grew up. Tell me about your family. Tell me about your parents. And it was just a wonderful conversation that we had. I told him about, my dad, my dad didn't finish high school. He actually just went 1 year of high school and then went to work in the orange groves of inland Southern California. My mom finished high school, but she was a stay-at-home mom until we were all out of the house and in school. And then she went and studied for her certificate, and she ultimately became an elementary school librarian. But it was incredibly important to both of them that we all have the opportunity to go to college. So I told President Obama all of these things, and I said at the end of it, well, President Obama, that's my story. It's the usual story. And he looked right at me and he said, it's a very American story.
Definitely is.
Yeah.
That's an amazing story to have. That's to experience that. That's amazing. So at some point you become the FAA administrator, and I don't know the history of all of them, but let's say, you weren't a pilot, you weren't an air traffic controller, you didn't work at the airlines as CEO or something. And this is a very technical organization, right? I mean, the current COO and DCOOs are both air traffic controllers. or former air traffic controllers. And so you come in, maybe you had some transportation, not necessarily aviation per se, right? Not at that level. So one is, was that a difficult situation? Then how did you gain people's trust? How did you come in there and be, I can run this organization, even though I did not sit there for 30 years controlling air traffic or building the systems or fixing them? So was that an issue, like for you, at least internally, that you had to kind of figure out a way around?
I don't know that I necessarily needed to figure out how to get around it. It's really much more a question of meeting people where they are and respecting what they do and respecting the mission and the importance of what it is. I think it's probably fair to say that when I first got to the agency, there was a little bit of tentativeness on the part of many of the people I met with. Not so much, hostility, but kind of tentativeness where they were trying to size me up.
Sure.
Does he respect what we do? Does he understand what we do? And is he willing to work with us in carrying out this important mission? And I think that in addressing that, I think a lot of what I was really trying to do was bring people together to, understand what's going on. We had when we were, for example, rebaselining the ERAM program, that involved a lot of actually going out to facilities and talking with frontline controllers, talking with members of the union, talking with people in management, talking with our contractors about what are we going to do, because the program at that point was significantly over budget and it's significantly beyond schedule.
Mhm.
And how do we develop a new baseline and hit that baseline, which we did. It's really asking a lot of questions and asking for people's views on how do we get this? What do solutions look like? I think a mistake that a leader can make is to come into an organization and adopt the view that you're expected to have all the answers, because nobody has all the answers, even in an organization where you do have a lot of a technical understanding of what's going on there. But in trying to find those answers, what you actually are able to do is learn a lot about the people that are actually involved in dealing with these issues day in and day out. And so I think it's important to be curious. It's important to listen. It's important to be open. And in the course of doing that, what I found was a group of people at the FAA that were incredibly generous with their time, that were willing to invest the time in helping me do the job and to do it well. And so after, a year and a half as deputy, when I think that was an incredibly important step in becoming administrator, because when I was nominated to be administrator, the agency knew me and I had been around for a while.
Sure.
And they were incredibly supportive.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely a lesson or lessons learned for anybody moving into a position. It doesn't have to be, 50,000 person organization. It's often people get a manager or leadership role somewhere and they did not go through that whole chain of whatever, that the folks do. And so it sounds like, respecting right off the bat what people do, that they earn that respect as well, listening to them, and then giving them a little bit of space to propose their solutions and bringing people together. The bringing people together thing is a theme for you, I think. We can add that as the fourth thing. Maybe that goes back to your, wanting to be a diplomat kind of thing, right? Because that's kind of the concept, is bringing diverse groups together from different countries and working on something together. Let me ask you something about being the FAA administrator. What is the hardest part of being the FAA administrator? Does it take some sort of toll on you personally? What is something people don't know about when you're in that position?
Well, it's an incredibly important organization, and safety is paramount. It's interesting. We are dealing, because the system is so safe, you have a situation where the public assumes it's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't say that, but I think that's kind of the expectation. There is this expectation of perfection. But those of us that are professionals in aviation safety know that it's really a question about managing risk. And how do you minimize risk to an acceptable level? But at the same, because if you wanted to eliminate risk, we simply wouldn't.
Just wouldn't fly, right?
We wouldn't fly. And so how do you actually manage risk? And that is the challenge that you have to constantly navigate. And there are very technical ways of looking at that, probabilities and data and all of that sort of stuff. But an important part of managing risk is also balancing that against public expectations. And that's a conversation that I think that we in aviation need to be having every single day. Are we seeing things where the data might tell us we don't have a problem or that we have managed risk to an acceptable level, but we constantly need to be asking, but what is different about this? Has something changed? How is it evolving? And evaluating not only what does the data tell us, but also what is the public perception of that. Mm-hmm. That's a hard thing because I think that we tend to get very comfortable with where we are in any organization, not just a safety organization. Sure. And the hard thing about a place like the FAA is you have to be looking not only at what's happening today, but how is it evolving in subtle ways over time, or is it positioned for new things that are coming at us in the future? I wouldn't say it's one of those things that, is a deep, dark secret. What I found is the organization, by virtue of its important day-to-day mission, can be very tactically focused. What's happening right now, and how do we adapt to that? Mm-hmm. It's harder for the organization to be thinking 1 year, 2 years, 3 years out of what's coming at us, whether it's drones when I was at the agency, whether it's advanced air mobility, whether it's the exponential growth we see in commercial space launches, whether it is how technology is evolving and, are there opportunities to get better efficiency out of our air traffic system? How are we training people, to operate within the national airspace system? What about autonomy and automation? How do those factor in? And how do those change the risk profile? And I think that's an important thing that leadership in the agency needs to be focused on. It's not just a question of, at the end of the day, did you have the same number of landings as takeoffs? Yeah. But what's going to be happening 6 months, 1 year, 2 years from now? And are we positioning ourselves to be ready for that development?
All those things you mentioned are still being worked out on some level, right?
They are.
Because drones aren't necessarily yet flying everywhere, or air taxis are not really everywhere yet. And they will be. I think they're coming sooner than, obviously when you were there, but it's even like exponentially faster. And so Sure. It's going to be interesting to see how all that stuff weaves into the current system. I got a couple questions that I think are interesting, and some of them are a theme that I'm asking leaders, kind of the same question. Let me start with, if you had a time machine and you went back in time to give yourself, a younger version of Michael, some advice, what would that advice be?
That's a really good question. I think the advice would be to be a good listener. I kind of figured that out, but when I first came into leadership, I made the mistake that a lot of people make of assuming that you are expected to have answers. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is, I don't know, let's figure this out together. And so it's to recognize that nobody has a monopoly on the great ideas or the answers, but you need to approach any organization, any job with a level of humility. And a big part of that is a willingness to listen and to ask questions. Mm-hmm. It's a level of curiosity. And I think the mistake that a lot of young people make, I certainly made it, is that if you ask questions and that it's somehow being perceived as a lack of qualifications on your part. And you can't look at it that way. You have to look at it more as, in asking questions, what it actually is demonstrating is an expression of interest.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to be asked questions all the time, because one thing I've noticed, I'm sure we've all experienced this, where just in life, you say something, you're like, I think I got my point across, I understand what I mean. And then a question comes and you're like, that's not at all what I said. And that's okay. But if they never asked, if people are just quiet, then the whole message is completely different and I think we talked about it, maybe Jen, it was with Tash Durkins or one of those podcasts, probably hers, about just saying, I don't know, I don't have all the answers. and adding in, let's work together. I think people want to at least hear something, even if it's, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because then you're at least acknowledging what they're saying and acknowledging that you're on it, if you will, right? You're there with them.
Well, it's also equally important that they not hear nothing.
Yeah.
Because sometimes there is a tendency, and we've all experienced it, where you send some question off into the void and then silence.
Mm-hmm.
And how frustrating is that?
Very.
You wonder, did they not get the message, or am I being blown off, or what have you? Yes. And oftentimes, just, hey, I'm busy, or you're asking a good question that I don't know the answer to, and so we're going to have to, I'm going to have to spend a little time on it. It's just important to acknowledge. Don't assume that silence is just being received as, I'll get back to you later. Sometimes it's being perceived as, oh, maybe this person doesn't think I'm important.
Oh, absolutely. I think some people tell me I do it too much, but I respond to everything, at least with a thumbs up, just because acknowledging, or I say something, but then I also expect it back. Because of that, and sometimes actually for just basic reasons, like say you're meeting someone for lunch and you're like, hey, let's meet here instead. If the person doesn't respond, I mean, you just need to know whether they're going to meet you there or not, right? There's almost like basic needs, but I think acknowledging people is really important. I did a working genius. I don't know if you've done that test.
No, I haven't.
It's kind of like the Myers-Briggs, the 16 personalities. One of the things that apparently really annoys me is when people don't acknowledge my message or respond. So, and I'm like, that's true. That does bother me, because it's not, I don't assume that it's something negative, but then I don't know what, I don't, now it's like a weight now still on me. Because sometimes you're like, if you ask a question, you're like, you had a question, you gave the person the question or whatever it is, the weight's kind of off of you a little bit. Now you can go to something else. But if the person never acknowledges, you still almost have to like keep that. You're like, all right, wait, I still have this question that I got to now almost write it down because I don't want to forget, because the person never responded. It's that kind of stuff. So let's talk about the Glen Gilbert Award. That's huge. The highest honor, right, in aviation, essentially. What does that mean to you, receiving this award?
Well, it means a lot, but I think it's important to recognize that air traffic and aviation is the ultimate team sport. And it's really, I think, a reflection of a lot of work of a lot of people. And I had the privilege to be the FAA Administrator during a critical time when we were doing an awful lot of really important and good foundational work for what the future of air traffic needs to be here in the U.S. and actually globally. And so I think it's incredibly meaningful, but at the same time, let's not lose sight of the fact that I happen to be leading an extraordinary group, not only in the FAA, but also across the industry. If I think of all the people that dedicated time to things like the Next Gen Advisory Committee, or people that worked with us on aviation rulemaking committees as we were trying to figure out what a way forward was going to look like for some of these new entrants that we were talking about a little while ago. So I think that it's incredibly meaningful, but at the same time, I think what it reflects is what we are acknowledging is the work of an awful lot of people.
That's a great answer. I look forward to your speech tomorrow. That's really amazing. So congrats again. Michael, what's, by all accounts of traditional definitions in people's heads, you're a successful person. But, for you as a person, as you personally, Michael, how do you define success?
Well, I define success by your contribution, not only in the traditional metrics of financial success or, recognition, what have you, but how have you changed people's lives? What are you doing that is actually improving the lives of, people across large segments of society? That's incredibly important to me. It's also important, to look at it in the context of, people that are closest to you, family. I've had an incredibly supportive family, the family that I grew up with, those three sisters of mine, and of course the support of my parents. I have a wonderful wife who has put up with a lot as I have, moved through different points of my career. And I got a great son, who's actually in the industry. He's an engineer, unlike his dad. is doing great work in the aviation industry as well. And so I think that I take the greatest satisfaction from knowing that I've had a positive impact on the lives of people, or at least I hope I have.
So when all the, titles and roles, all that stuff starts to fade, right? What do you want your legacy to be?
That's, it's, I would like to think that when people talk about what I was able to contribute at the FAA and across my career, that there is a common thread of bringing people together to solve complex problems to benefit lives everywhere. And are we perfect? No. Were we always successful in some of the things that we worked on? No, we've had a few bad ideas out there that didn't work out as planned. But I think that if people would think about just the benefit of hearing different perspectives and leveraging a lot of great minds towards solving really tough problems, I really passionately believe that if we did more of that, we'd have a much more effective world that we were living in that was much more open and collaborative and would just be a better place for all of us. And so I think that it's important that we all strive to continue to do that.
I would agree. I'm sure you've testified in front of Congress. You've been asked a million questions from whether it was the 50,000 employees or the media or whoever. What's the question that you've always wanted to be asked but never were asked?
Well, that's. I think I'm wondering if is there a question out there.
Oh, you've had them all, maybe, yeah.
Well, I've had a lot of them. I think that one question that is often not asked is whether you're talking to media, whether you're talking to Congress. Oftentimes, the question is always framed as, "What are you doing about this?" Or why haven't you done whatever around this? Or how could this have happened? And all of that. Mm-hmm. What we often don't ask is, what can I do to help you? Mm-hmm. What can I do that would actually be beneficial for what you're trying to accomplish there? And I'm not saying it's never asked because sometimes it is. But that's always an incredibly welcome question because it causes you to do two things. First is think about, well, what would be helpful? What would I like to see? But it also completely changes the tenor of that conversation. It goes from being the accusatory, how could you have let this happen kind of question, to a recognition of a shared purpose that we all have. And how can we actually work together? And so I think that hearing that question is always welcome. And it's something that I think we would all benefit from hearing more.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I was wondering what you're going to say. That's a really good answer. And yeah, I mean, obviously, if somebody asks that, hopefully they do it genuinely and they want to actually help, because then it really matters. There's another tradition that we have, which is asking leaving a question for the next guest, but also answering the question from the previous guest. So the previous guest was Trevor Braun. I don't know if you know him. He's a leadership coach and author. His question was, why do you lead? Now, I know you're no longer a FAA administrator, but I think you're still leading. And you, obviously, in that role, you were. But, why did you do that? Why did you choose to lead?
It wasn't because I felt that I wanted to be head of a large organization. I chose it because I cared about the mission. And I felt that for a few years, maybe I could make a contribution there. And I think that every leader has to approach whatever they're doing in that way. Am I passionate about the mission? Is there something that I can do that would really make a contribution here? But then most importantly, to recognize that nobody's entitled to these positions forever. And at some point, you have to recognize that it will be time. You'll move on in one way or the other, and you have to be supportive of whatever comes next. and recognize that organizations change over time. But first and foremost, it starts with passion for what the organization is all about and what can I contribute to that.
That's a great answer. Good, very good answer. So speaking of what's next, what are you up to these days?
Well, I'm serving on the boards of 3 public companies, 2 in the aviation industry, Delta Airlines and Joby Aviation, and then 1 in the broader transportation technology space, a company called Vera Mobility Corporation. And then I'm also privileged to serve on the board of the MITRE Corporation. So it keeps me pretty busy. I'm far from retired. Yeah, I do a little bit of project work on the side as well. No, I'm not leading a large organization. This whole question of, when you move to corporate governance, it's a very different role that you play, because your role is not to run these organizations. Your role is to represent the shareholders, your stakeholders, and to ask questions on their behalf, but to recognize and respect that management is ultimately responsible for leadership of these organizations.
So how was that transition for you, going from being essentially in charge to being on the side? I mean, it sounds like you have some experience doing that, where because you're still influencing and leading in a different way. But was that an interesting transition for you?
Well, it's interesting in the sense, like, for example, the first board I joined was Delta Airlines. What was fascinating for me was we tend to think of ourselves as having developed a level of expertise. And, clearly I have a lot of experience and expertise in aviation, which is one of the things that they were looking for. But what was entirely new for me was the whole commercial side of the business. What are the markets that we're looking to serve? How do we make decisions on how we deploy the networks? How do we, provide the level of service? What is that service? And how do we distinguish ourselves among our competitors in terms of the offerings that we have, that are out there? And that's just been incredibly fascinating to me. And so it's both a great learning experience and also an opportunity to, I think, through the questions that I'm able to ask and what I learned from my other board colleagues, I think we've got a great board. In fact, all 3 of these boards are great boards, but it's an opportunity to, be part of another great team. Yes, in a different role. And yes, you're not expected to be the decision maker, on every critical decision, but at the same time to make a contribution based on the experience that we all bring, which might be quite different, but at the same time to learn from our colleagues across the organization.
Still bringing people together, right? Yeah. So one last question. A lot of the guests we've had, I think all of them, Jen, correct me if I'm wrong, when they were 18, 19, they ended up somewhere else, right? This is not what they thought was going to happen. And that's life, I think, in general. If this path didn't work out for you, what did you want to be besides the diplomat thing? Like, where do you see yourself if there was like 2 alternate universes?
That's a very good question. I think that when I graduated college, it was kind of scary because, yes, I had achieved, that milestone of a college degree. It was incredibly important to my parents, but I was scared to death because I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, what I wanted to be when I grew up. Now, given where I am now, I was speaking at a conference, and it was one of those introductions where somebody's reading your entire resume. And what I got up and I said to the group, and I said, well, after hearing all of that, you can draw one of 2 conclusions. The first is that I've been incredibly blessed and have had wonderful opportunities in a lot of different areas. Or the other conclusion is that I can't hold down a job, given the variety of things that I've been involved in. I gave a commencement speech, and my message to the graduates was, it is actually okay if you don't have clarity on what that endpoint in your career is going to look like. The most important thing is to recognize that where your career is concerned, there are no right steps, there are no wrong steps. There are only next steps. And if you find yourself in a place that maybe isn't exactly what you thought it was going to be, then just take another step and move on. You need to focus on the journey and less on the outcome. For me, I have found that adopting that mindset has led to an incredibly fascinating, interesting, and rewarding career. And yeah, maybe I didn't end up as a diplomat, an ambassador, or whatever,
There's still time.
but, but what I've had is, it's been a wonderful journey, and I've met a lot of wonderful people along the way.
Well, great. Well, Michael, thank you very much. Thank you for teaching us about humility, steadiness, bringing people together, all the insights. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.